And welcome. In today's episode we have another crankset, which this time is a SRAM GXP Quark Riken, I don't know what it's called, but to be honest I don't really care. And this has come in from a customer who wanted a BB30A to GXP bottom bracket conversion. Now normally in the past what I've done is I have turned these from a GXP setup to a Shimano setup, and then people have gone on their way, and that is typically what happens in the World Tour, although those teams have stopped using GXP and they've moved on to something else. But when you have a power meter, which this is, that doesn't work very well. For some bizarre reason, if you turn it into a Shimano bearing arrangement, the power readings can be quite erratic. I don't know why. It's probably a question for Shane Miller, so I'm hoping he watches and can answer the question. I almost forgot my Disney princess blanket, so let's put that down first of all. Right, to give you a quick overview of how this works, let me zoom in first of all. Right, this is the drive side, this is the non-drive side. On GXP, the non-drive side crank arm is fitted on a set of tapered splines, and I will show you those in a minute when I take this off. There is a significant step between the drive side and the non-drive side, so it's 24mm on this side and it goes down to 22mm on that side. The bearing on this side is fixed, the bearing on that side floats. There's also a wave washer that is installed in some applications, so it is installed in this application. In fact, I put this one on. GXP axles are steel, so they're unlike 30mm axles, which tend to be aluminium. Steel is what I would consider a superior material for a crank. Now I'm going to remove the non-drive side crank arm, and it's literally just a question of unwinding it off the splines. Now I'm hoping you can see in the camera shot, if not I'm going to zoom in. Move that. So on GXP the locking system is on these tapered splines, so the splines get wider as we go in towards the centre of the bike frame, and that's how that crank arm is locked on. Now, be under no illusions, GXP is utter crap. You would have to be a complete and utter fucking fruitcake to buy a GXP crank on its mechanical merits, because it has at least 20% more friction, and that is mainly due to its bearing setup. Now, I don't think SRAM are stupid engineers, but their execution of it is pretty diabolical. There are some serious problems with GXP, and the biggest one is SRAM's manufacturing tolerances, which are shite. If I was a manufacturing engineer, I would go outside and kill myself several times over, but I'm not, so thankfully I'm still with you. But I'll explain what goes on here. So this is the chap's crank, and these are the particular foibles not necessarily associated with this crank, but also some others. So on this side we've got the 24mm bearing. So I went to the bicycle shop, actually bought some SRAM original bike bearings from the bike shop, who has an account with the SRAM distributor, which I believe is a company called Zyro Fisher in the UK. Anyway, so this is the 24mm bearing, it goes on this side, so we slide that on. That's fine, no issues really there. This is the non-drive side bearing. It's a peculiar bearing. You can see there's a bit that sticks out that it's just abnormal. The inside of that bearing is 22mm, and it's designed to go onto this shaft like this, like that. And then you put the crank arm onto the end, tighten, like so, and then you tighten it up to, I think it's 40 Newton meters, something like that, and jobs are good. Now, this is where the problems start with GXP. On a taper, you'll get to a certain point where you tighten and the torque increases exponentially, but the gap in between doesn't increase that much. So you can probably, hopefully, just see there's a small gap there. In fact, if I rattle the bearing, you can see it. So there's your first problem. That distance between the crank arm and that step varies on SRAM axles. The next diabolical problem is now I'm going to have to take this off. In fact, let's speed things up a bit. The next problem is the SRAM spacing. So the distance between there and there, which is the end of the 24mm step, can also vary. So there's our two issues. On this chap's particular crank arm, after I bought these bearings just as a check, there's something ridiculous going on. So on the 24mm side, there's nothing happening there. On the 22mm side, that is a rattling good fit. So the axle has worn there, and it shouldn't do, and I'm not sure why. I don't know if that was ground undersized or if that's how it happened over time, but it's a shite fit. In engineering, you'd say that was slacker than a wizard's cuff, but that's what we've got. So that's the first problem, and I've measured that, and it's not quite perfectly round. So it makes me think it's left the factory like that, which is pretty typical of SRAM. Of the ones I've seen, this is nothing unusual. It's pretty run-of-the-mill. So you can see the problems with the dimensions that you've got. And it's one of the reasons why I have stopped making GXP bottom brackets unless you send the crank in. The next problem we have is with the bike frame that this is going into, and it's a BB30A. I've got one of my BB30A bottom brackets here. It's a racing spec unit. It's just a body. And the edge of the bike frame is here, where that flange is, and hopefully you can just about see there is a line there where this chamfer starts. So that they are the edges of the frame. In the case of GXP, into any BB30A bottom bracket, the bearing on this side sits away from the frame, so it's completely isolated. So that's one of the reasons why it's less likely to creak, one of my bottom brackets. On this side, and this is unusual, this bearing sits half inside the frame and half outside the frame, so it makes isolating any compression problems quite tricky. So that's a technical difficulty in manufacturing of a GXP bottom bracket for BB30A. It's a bit different if you've got BB86 or BB30, because on BB86 both the bearings are inside of the frame. On BB30 both bearings are actually outside of the frame parameters. Just to summarize the problems we've got, the bearing on that side, no problem with that. Bearing on this side is slack. Slack both axially and radially. Not sure why it's slack axially, because I've tightened that to the recommended torque and it hasn't compressed. Now some people might say, oh, you're missing a dust cap. Well, I've tried the dust cap in and the same problem, it's just not as big. So there's that aspect, and there's also the BB30A aspect, which is having half the bearing inside and half the bearing outside when it is a fixed bearing. So that just complicates matters even further. So I've had a little show and tell about what the problems with this crankset are, and now I'm going to take you inside and explain to you how I'm going to fix this engineering abomination from some wankers from wherever the fuck they're from, but they're just wankers. Right, let's begin with my presentation, which I'm going to press the button on now, and hopefully you should be able to see it. Now I wasn't quite sure what to call this, because you know that usually happens, and I didn't want to come across as doing clickbait. So I've called it. SRAM GXP has been designed by shitbags, and now I'm going to prove it. There was a bit of a toss-up between shitbags, cunt, pricks, fucking wankers, dickheads, not quite specks of shite on the anus of humanity. And as per usual, by Hambini, aged 5. Now, I've installed a brand new slide for my next slide, so the second slide after the first slide. The Hambini pre-cock womble. And it's really just to silence some of those people who take, great offence at some of these videos. So if you're easily offended, go and get off and watch that Linus Tech Tips, right? You are tuning in for a fucking adult discussion, not the pissing Lion King, okay? And then if you're a manufacturer that gets pissed off by me reaming the shit out of you, well, well done, because now you know what it feels like to for a customer of yours that has bought something that doesn't quite meet your standards or their standards. And then the final one, if you really want to pursue some litigation methods, find someone who is technically adept. I don't really like writing multiple page essays defining why you're wrong and then not receiving a response. I want a proper technical, discussion. If you're going to take me to the cleaners, then you need to try harder. So I want someone who's technically minded, not the fucking Saturday boy, not the cleaner, and not the photocopier engineer. Right, now we'll move on to the crank. Right, so the crank, wherever I put it, where did I put it? No, the crank's here. The crank. History of the crank, right? So the first thing is the cyclist had problems assembling it at home. He bolted it all together and it rattled around and he had some little problems like that. It was a rattling fit. It will be akin to shagging a bucket or, shagging a bucket is not preferable. Some people might get off on shagging a bucket, but I guess most people wouldn't. But what I'm really trying to say is it's a very poor fit. So, if that's the penis and that's the vagween, then want something that's a bit... We'll leave it at that. Right, SRAM mechanical tolerances have historically been shite. So that's not just me saying that. Over time, they are just wank. And I've never really understood why, because they try and copy Shimano, but just do a shit job of doing it. But anyway, and then the next thing is there's a power meter on the crankset, so we need to be careful to make sure we don't screw that up so we don't get erratic power readings. Right, run out and dimensional check. So let me show you the SolidWorks file. Right. If I've done this correctly. Balls. Right. This is the SolidWorks file. I've called all these errors on the left-hand side here. I'm not quite sure how I did that, but I did. Anyway, to give you some dimensions, so the wide side is 24mm, 23.99. The narrow side is supposed to be 22mm, but on this crankset we had 21.99 and 21.94 as a minimum, so it's slightly oval. And then this bit in between was 23.4. That's not a critical dimension. This, which is the concentricity, or total indicated run out, I zeroed it on this side, so I got 0.0005 on the drive side, and then by the time we got to the non-drive side we got 0.1, so it's not particularly good. And then the space between the crank arm and the step, which is this one here, this 12.5, that can vary quite a lot on SRAM axles. I've seen anything from sort of 11 to 13.5. That might not sound very much, but that is quite significant. Right, let me take you back to the presentation. Has that worked? So I've just shown you the SolidWorks file. Drive side, perfectly acceptable, nothing really wrong with that. The non-drive side is, well, as I've just mentioned, it is eccentric. Now, is it factory crap machining, and have we had exacerbated wear? SRAM manufacturing is crap. The problem is most people can't measure it to tell you it's crap, but I'm just telling you it's crap because it is. I mean, the tolerances, the amount of variation between their individual parts is massive if you compare them to specifically Shimano. And then because it's been machined poorly, has that exacerbated the wear? So you don't know how much of an effect that's had. And then that business about the 12.5mm, that's caused by the taper. And that is, again, the taper hasn't been deep enough, or the tool that's made the taper has worn. Again, a symptom of crap machining. Now, you may have seen this slide before, but it's just to give you an overview of the difference between the two bearing arrangements, because GXP is very different to Shimano, and I've labelled it Shimano. Where's my laser pointer? Pointer options, laser pointer. Right, so Shimano has two bearings that are identical. SRAM GXP has this fixed bearing and this floating bearing, and a preload bolt here for the Shimano system. That's your fixed bearing. Wave washer preloads this bearing on GXP. So on Shimano, both bearings are free to float, and the slack is taken up by the preload bolt. On GXP, this bearing is completely locked, so that becomes your datum and everything moves away from it. It's a poor system. The other thing I wanted to add was, in the last presentation with the practice crankset, some people asked, these two diagrams look the same. Well, there's actually a step there. It may not be all that easy to see, but there is a step, whereas this one doesn't have it. And then the forces that are acting upon it. So on Shimano, you've got forces acting equally on both bearings, whether you're putting your left foot down or your right foot down. The forces are acting almost the same. The bearings are the same size. On GXP, the non-drive side bearing is taking all of your axial load, and the drive side bearing is just taking purely radial load. Shimano, it can take a very slight misalignment quite well, and the advantage to having both bearings equally loaded is you are less likely to get some sort of creak. On the SRAM GXP, that non-drive side bearing is heavily loaded. It's a lot more likely to creak, and because you've clamped this side up, you don't have any real wiggle room with regards to misalignment. There is 20% more friction, and I will come to that in a second, and it is technically inferior. Most machinery is set up like this. So if you took a fan from an industrial application, you would have a fixed bearing and a floating bearing, or an axial bearing and two radial bearings. So it's actually set up like this. So this is more like an industrial setup. But in like a fan, you've just got load going one way, and it just stays like that until you press the off switch. Whereas on a bicycle crank, the load is going both ways, because you're putting your right foot down and then your left foot down, and that's what's happening. Right, this is why you get more friction on GXP. So if I took this bearing here and I took what I've done is I've cut that bit off. So this outer race is here and here. The red line represents the bearing running track. So on a Shimano bearing, it is dead straight. So you just have one line that runs straight across it at a position. On GXP, you've got more of an S shape, and that's because as you put your right foot down, the bearing balls move to one side. As you put your left foot down, they move back towards the other. So you end up with this S-shaped pattern, and that's where your increased friction comes from, and you're also a little more likely to wear this bearing out. The next contributor to this clusterfuck is you know, a regular person that, or company that we talk about on the Hambini channel, which is Cannondale. And BB30A is the standard of mega fucktards. It really is shit. It's the result of engineering incompetence. They designed a bottom bracket standard specifically for gravel bikes, as if a mountain bike wasn't good enough, a gravel bike. And that's so that the chains, and with disc brakes, and that's so that you can have asymmetrical chainstays. Why didn't they just go for BB86 or BB386 Evo? Don't know, dickheads. Right, the designer, well, you know, I make some scathing statements. He needs to be shot or sterilised because we don't want his offspring polluting the engineering world with more shit. And in the aims of keeping your carbon output low, shoot him with one bullet in the balls and you'll do both jobs at once. I estimate you'll save at least 150 kilos in carbon by only having to do one bullet. Right, I need to show the bearing for, yeah, so let me show you another drawing. So this is, well, in fact, let me show you the 3D first. This is a schematic or a 3D representation of a BB30A bike. So this grey thing will be the frame, the orange thing will be the bottom bracket inside it. If I just tick yes. Now, you can see on the drive side, the bearing is clear of the bike frame, so it sticks out further than the frame. On the non-drive side, it is half inside the frame and half outside the frame. Please note, this only applies to, well, one of the aims of the game is whenever you've got this bearing set up, you want it as wide as possible. If you adopt Cannondale's method, the bearings are inside the shell, but it wouldn't work for GXP. So that's it in 3D, and if I show you the drawing, which is this, it's maybe a bit more clearer. So it's almost half the ball is within the frame and the other half isn't. On the drive side, you don't have that problem. Right, so let me take you back to the PowerPoint. Right here. Right, and this is a schematic of what a normal crankset looks like. So a normal GXP crankset looks like. So you've got 24mm on the drive side, 23.4, which is not really a critical dimension sort of on the step, and then 22 on the non-drive side. In the case of this crank, you've got your datum, which is the 24mm drive side, the not critical bit. And then you've got this 0.05. I've actually done this wrong because it was 0.1 total indicated run out on the non-drive side. So it's eccentric. Yeah. Then we've got generic GXP problems. So let me show you on the SolidWorks file. GXP. Right. I think I've probably gone through this, but I'll do it again. The position of this crank set or the crank arm can move, and it depends on how well the tapers have been made. So you can move it probably a millimeter or millimeter and a half if you're having a bad day. So that's one problem. There's obviously the fixed bearing. You've got a ground hardened bearing possibly rubbing up against okay, it's a steel shaft, but it's not anywhere near as hard. And the bearing on the other side is again just a radial bearing. So it is an extremely poor setup. See, that's the generic problems that you can have. Some people have asked, you know, why don't you use Shimano setup for this? And the main reason is because you've got a power meter on there. So if you use the Shimano setup, the power meter readings would be skewed. So that's why I don't do that. But if you go on my website, you can see how you can set it up as a Shimano bearing arrangement. Then we come on to the fix. So it's technically not difficult to do. The major scope of a fuck up is with a dimensional stack up, because the measuring inside that crankset is a pain in the rear end. So that's where you can get an error. First thing to do is true the crank up. Then we need to install the appropriate sized rings, which I'll come to, and I'm going to show you how I fixed it now. Right, so if we go back to SolidWorks, oh god, look, right, window. This is the finished GXP crankset. If I take a cut through there, not crankset, bottom bracket. So on the drive side, it uses one of my plastic Delrin adapters. One of the problems you get is you get under rotation, so that's when the crank moves slightly out of sync with the bearing and it rubs the crank. You want to try and avoid that. Well, you can't really avoid it, but you want to avoid the wear associated with it, so you need some sacrificial element. So a Delrin spacer in there, or Delrin top hat, is what I typically use. On the non-drive side, this is where the fun and games begin. It needs two rings, so it needs an inner ring and an outer ring, and here's what I've made. Well, these are just mock-ups, but inner ring and outer ring, and they correspond to these two parts here and here, and they lock around the bearing to hold it in. The problem with GXP is you can't really move your chain line very easily because this bearing is locked. So in order to move that chain line, you would have to change or shim that part and that part. These two parts are unsuitable to be made of plastic. Well, you probably could make it out of plastic, but I've chosen to go with aluminium because as a one-off, a plastic, it tends to deform as you machine it, whereas the aluminium's much more stable. If I show you the drawing of that, that is what it looks like. So if I change the colours, there we go. So that is the brown or gold is the shell, the red is the bearings, and the purple are the spacers or top hats. So on the non-drive side, there's two spacers, one on the inside, one on the outside. So this side has to be assembled first before this side is assembled. Before designing a new bottom bracket or testing all of these things, what you have to do is you need to true these surfaces up. So I've already explained that this non-drive side bearing landing was not was eccentric compared to the one on the other side. It was also eccentric to the tapers. So I've trued that up, and that's one of the reasons why this bearing was a rattling good fit. If you had a nylon bottom bracket, that would probably be alright, but that isn't really going to cut it. So that's what I've done. I've cleaned that up, just taken a lick off there before we carry on any further. Now, if you've listened to all of that, you will have got to this point in the video. This is the original SRAM shite part that we got from the distributor, who, I don't know if he's a wanker, but, well, he trades in SRAM, so he's probably a twat. And these are the parts that I've used to replace it. Now, this is an NSK bearing. It's a 6805 VV, and I've picked that mainly for clearance issues, which I've already described. This is the inside part, and this is the outside part. So this replaces the dust cap, which normally on my bottom brackets are Delrin. So if I bring one of the shells back over, that would go into there, followed by that. That piece goes on the inside, That on the outside, and all that goes into there, like so. Before we actually build this up, it's always worthwhile testing it. So that's what we're going to do. So we're going to put that onto there, and then clamp it all up with an Allen key. Let's get it motorized. Now there'll probably be a load of do-gooders on the internet who say, oh, you shouldn't use an impact gun on a crankset. You're right, you shouldn't. So we'll just tighten that up so it's tight. And unlike that one, this one does not actually float, and I put a little black mark on there so you can see it spinning freely. So we know that that works. And in true Blue Peter fashion, now some of you may not know what Blue Peter is, but it's this shite TV show for little kids, where they make things, have people on there, and just generally do shite stuff, which, well, irritates me and my autism. Anyway, one of their slogans is, here's one I made earlier. So here is one I made earlier. Here we are, it's here. So this is a racing black BB30. The body is more stiff than a normal one, but the principle is the same. So you can see the dust cap on that side and the Delrin dust cap on that side. Inside, I don't know if you can see it, but there's the inside piece. When we put the axle through, that will become captive. So what we'll do now is we'll take the crank arm off. And then put the new bottom bracket on. I have left the wave washer on there, and now I just need to get this lined up so it's the right way. Pop that through so it comes right all the way through. I don't know if that's on all the way. I think it is. When tightening, don't use an impact gun for the final bit. Okay, let's try that. Okay, so that's got it. Now let's give it a spin. Oh yeah, look at that. Oh, zoom out. Oh, that's as far as the zoom goes. Oh, check that out. That is just asexual. Asexual. Yeah, I've always dissed spin tests because they are a load of bollocks, but for checking alignment, they're a fairly good measure. And this one, yeah, that's a good job, that. I'm pleased with that. So now this is going to go off to the customer, and then he can fit it in his bike. And that's the end of this video. I really hope you enjoyed it. If you've got one takeaway from this video, it is to avoid SRAM if you want mechanical excellence. Yes, the electronic ETAP shifting might be the dog's bollocks, but mechanically and how they fit together and all of that kind of stuff, they are just shite. So I would not recommend you get a SRAM crankset. And also the other takeaway is, if you are using a power meter, be very careful with the bearing setup. Obviously I can only talk about my bearing setups, but I'm sure the same thing applies to other manufacturers as well. As always, please tell your mates and whack that subscribe button. Put some comments in the comments box. I do read them all, and I try to reply to as many as possible. Keep sending me emails if you want a particular type of video on the channel, and that's it. So until next time, thanks very much for watching.